September 1944. A rail junction near Verdun, France. 40 heavy steel freight cars sit completely motionless on a rusty side track. The locomotive breathes a steady, heavy pulse of gray steam into the damp morning air, its massive boiler fully packed with thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, crates of heavy artillery shells, and boxes of fresh field rations. This massive supply train is supposed to be rolling hard toward the forward supply depot of the United States Third Army. General George S. Patton's armored divisions are tearing across France, but right now, their fuel tanks are completely bone dry. The vital advance has stopped dead. Then, without warning, the entire 40-car train vanishes completely from the tracking board. A pencil line scratches through the manifest. Patton discovers the truth and strikes back with a calculated, blistering response that a desk-bound staff officer will never forget. This is the story of what Patton did when a desk officer in Paris redirected his fuel train to a slower army. It is a glimpse into the hidden conflicts that shaped the push to Berlin. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the war behind the war. Colonel Oscar Koch was 47 years old and claimed Milwaukee, Wisconsin as his hometown. He served as the Chief of Intelligence for the United States Third Army. Koch was a quiet, meticulous man who spent his nights staring at tracking maps under the dim hum of a single desk lamp. Before the war, he worked as a professional investigator, a job that taught him to look for the tiny irregularities others missed. He had lost his younger brother to an artillery shell outside Cherbourg, a personal grief that buried itself deep into his work ethic. Koch did not sleep much. He lived on black coffee and stale cigarettes. He knew that a delayed shipment did not mean a late train. It meant dead Americans on the front line. His sharp eyes were the ones that caught the sudden, inexplicable deletion of 40 freight cars from the tracking board at the Verdun rail junction. Colonel Richard Pemberton was 44 years old and came from a wealthy family in Hartford, Connecticut. He served on the safe logistics staff, working out of a massive, heavily guarded palace in Paris. Pemberton believed that warfare was entirely a matter of mathematical equations and administrative balance. He often told his subordinates that an army was only as good as its filing system, and that theater-wide equilibrium mattered far more than individual battlefield momentum. He wore a perfectly tailored Class A uniform with razor-sharp creases and highly polished cordovan shoes that had never stepped in mud. His desk sat exactly 400 miles behind the nearest active foxhole. Pemberton had recently drafted a supply directive that used the phrase equitable distribution 7 times while mentioning the words combat effectiveness 0 times. He viewed Patton's rapid, aggressive advance across the French countryside as a reckless violation of standard logistical theater planning. By September 1944, the Allied armies had shattered the German defensive lines in Normandy and were racing across the plains of France. The speed of the advance surprised even the highest commanders at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Tank columns were moving so quickly that they were outrunning the heavy truck convoys, tasked with hauling fuel from the coast. The logistical network was stretched to a dangerous breaking point. French rail lines were heavily damaged by months of pre-invasion bombing, leaving only a few operating junctions to handle thousands of tons of cargo. Every single gallon of gasoline was a precious commodity that could determine the end of the war. In the middle of this logistical nightmare, a dangerous operational philosophy began to take root among the senior staff officers in Paris. Many high-ranking desk officers felt that the advance should be uniform and cautious. They watched their maps with a desire for neat, orderly lines rather than exploitation of enemy weakness. When one army broke out into the open, these staff officers saw it as an imbalance that threatened their carefully prepared spreadsheets. Other field commanders had routinely accepted these bureaucratic delays, choosing to slow down their units and wait for the official paperwork to clear through Paris. They allowed the rear echelon coordinators to dictate the tempo of frontline operations from their distant, comfortable offices. But the men on the ground were the ones paying the ultimate price for these administrative decisions. Infantrymen and tankers were forced to wait in the mud, watching the horizon, while their momentum evaporated. The German army was gaining valuable time to dig new trenches, lay fresh minefields, and regroup their battered panzer divisions. At the cold, damp rail junction near Verdun, the paperwork had finally caught up with the reality of the war. Capt. Frank Miller from Columbus, Ohio, walked into the field logistics office at the Verdun rail junction and held up a handful of yellow manifest slips. He looked directly at the man sitting behind the large oak desk. "I am tracking a 40-car supply train that vanished from our board 2 hours ago," Miller said. "It was carrying 40,000 gallons of fuel and 60 tons of artillery ammunition, earmarked for the 3rd Army Depot." Colonel Pemberton did not look up from his paperwork. He picked up a silver fountain pen and carefully signed his name at the bottom of a typed memo. "The train has not vanished, Captain," he replied. "It has been successfully reassigned." "Reassigned by whose authority?" Miller asked. "My tanks are sitting out in the open fields near the border with completely empty fuel cells." "The train was rerouted by my direct order," Pemberton said, finally leaning back in his leather chair and crossing his arms. "It has been sent to the 1st Army Sector." Miller stepped closer to the desk and laid the manifest slips down on the blotter. "1st Army is holding a defensive position, Colonel. They are completely stationary. 3rd Army is actively advancing against a retreating enemy force. Every single vehicle we own is completely stranded because we lack the gasoline to move them forward." Pemberton picked up a clean sheet of paper from his tray and pointed a manicured finger at a column of figures. "This theater requires a proper administrative balance. Captain, your 3rd Army has already consumed a highly disproportionate share of the available regional resources over the last 14 days. We must maintain an equitable distribution between all active commands." "We are trying to win a war," Miller said, his voice tightening. "We do not need balance. We need fuel to destroy the remaining panzer divisions before they can reform their defensive lines." "You need to understand organizational structure," Pemberton replied, his tone remaining perfectly flat and detached. "Combat effectiveness is a secondary metric when compared to systemic equilibrium. An army that moves too rapidly creates a severe logistical vacuum behind its own lines. By redirecting these supplies to a slower command, we ensure that the entire theater remains uniform. This is sabotage by bureaucracy," Miller said. "You are stopping a successful offensive just to satisfy a spreadsheet." "I am officially protesting this order to the Army Quartermaster. Your protest is noted and filed," Pemberton said, tapping the paper on his desk. "But the train is already moving north toward the 1st Army warehouses. The decision is administrative, permanent, and fully authorized by this logistics command." Miller turned on his heel and walked out of the office to find a functioning radio transmitter. The urgent report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top command jeep pulled directly into the gravel courtyard of the Verdun rail junction. The vehicle coated in a thick layer of white road dust, the 4 polished brass stars on his helmet gleamed sharply under the gray French sky. His ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily in their custom leather holsters on his belt. The general climbed out of the vehicle and walked straight into the office, his boots striking the floorboards with a heavy, rhythmic cadence. Every clerk, typing specialist, and radio operator in the room froze instantly. The busy sound of clacking typewriter keys ceased entirely. The air in the room became dead silent. Patton did not raise his voice. He stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the man behind the desk. "Colonel Pemberton," Patton said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Did you order the rerouting of the 40-car supply train that was bound for my forward depot this morning?" "I did, General," Pemberton answered, his voice trembling slightly as he stood up and straightened his pressed tunic. The decision was based entirely on theater logistics directives. Are you aware that my armored divisions are currently sitting completely still because they have no gasoline? Patton asked, stepping closer to the desk. Yes, General, Pemberton said, adjusting a stack of papers. But my data indicates your current fuel consumption rate violates the equitable distribution parameters set by Paris. So you stopped an advancing army to fix a spreadsheet, Patton said. The balance between the armies must be maintained. Pemberton replied, gesturing to a chart on the wall. First Army requires their fair allocation. Patton studied the desk officer for a long moment. You have chosen to view this war through a keyhole of pure paperwork, Colonel. You sit in a warm room 400 miles behind the fighting line and decide that failure should be rewarded with extra supplies, while success is penalized with forced starvation. My men have outrun their lines because they are destroying the enemy force. Your equitable distribution is nothing more than administrative sabotage. An army that advances must receive the fuel to continue advancing. An army that does not advance should receive the motivation to start. You have two options. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. You will either sign the immediate reversal order to send that train back to my depot, or I will have military police lock you inside one of those empty freight cars on the siding and ship you directly to the front line without a single drop of fuel. Either way, this administrative interference ends today. Pemberton stared at the general's cold expression, his face turning pale. He reached down, picked up his silver fountain pen with a shaking hand, and quickly signed the emergency reversal order. The signed reversal order was carried out within 20 minutes by a detachment of 3rd Army Military Police. They marched directly onto the tracks at the Verdun rail junction, sidearms drawn, and confronted the train crew before the engine could switch to the northern line. The engineers threw the heavy iron levers back into reverse. The massive 40-car supply train began rolling backward, its steel wheels screeching loudly against the rails as it redirected back toward Patton's forward depot. Pemberton stood by his office window and watched the cargo slip away. He could smell the thick, oily scent of coal smoke and high-octane aviation gasoline drifting through the open glass as the train departed. Several front-line truck drivers, who had been waiting by their stranded vehicles, watched the train turn around, letting out a loud cheer that echoed across the gravel yard. Other staff officers in the building remained perfectly silent, staring down at their desks as the heavy freight cars rumbled past. The independent supply tracking system Koch ordered was established by noon, ensuring that no further shipments could be wiped from the board without immediate detection by 3rd Army intelligence. Colonel Oscar Koch remained with the 3rd Army until the final surrender in Europe, providing critical intelligence through the Battle of the Bulge and the drive into Germany. He returned home to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, after the cessation of hostilities, and compiled extensive analytical reports on military intelligence methods. Koch lived a quiet, private civilian life, rarely discussing his wartime service with neighbors, and passed away in 1970 at the age of 73. He kept a duplicate copy of the Verdun Rail Manifest inside his personal desk drawer for the remainder of his life. Colonel Richard Pemberton was quietly reassigned to a secondary logistics depot in southern England, 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Junction. He was completely bypassed for promotion during the final months of the war and retired from the military service in 1946. Pemberton returned to Hartford, Connecticut, where he entered the corporate sector as an efficiency manager for an industrial manufacturing firm. He remained deeply embittered about the incident until his death in 1968, frequently telling associates that frontline commanders had ruined the systemic purity of the European Theater Logistical Master Plan. General George S. Patton never recorded the confrontation in his official operational diary, leaving the signed reversal order to sit quietly in his confidential staff files. He mentioned the bureaucratic dispute only once in a private letter to his wife, noting that rear echelon coordinators were often more dangerous to an advance than enemy minefields. Patton maintained that an army could always recover from a shortage of rations, but an offensive could never survive a shortage of operational momentum imposed by a desk in Paris. Some historians have argued that the administrative decisions made in Paris were a necessary safeguard against a chaotic breakout. They point out that Patton's explosive advance was stretching the logistics line to a dangerous degree, risking a major counteroffensive if the flanks became exposed. In their view, keeping the armies in a neat alignment prevented a tactical disaster. Others have argued the exact opposite, stating that the rigid insistence on equal distribution squandered a rare opportunity to end the war months ahead of schedule. They believe that starving a successful advance simply gave the enemy army breathing room to regroup. What is certain is that the confrontation at the Junction permanently altered how field commanders tracked their supplies. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have accepted the decision from Paris to preserve diplomatic unity? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the war behind the war, make sure to subscribe.